Good morning again, everybody. It's Regina and Matt. We're at UBC School today, chatting with you, and we are a warm welcome to you. So I think Matt has announced a couple of times that this session is work integration, social enterprises, developing innovative and effective employment opportunities. So we have lots of people in the room, so great to see people from all over Canada. Really, really great. Lots of familiar faces or lots of familiar names. So a warm welcome to you. Thank you for being with us. You know our team. For those of you who've been with us before, you know our team. Jordan is our technology support. Matthew is our just wonderful technology person who keeps us up to date and makes sure that everybody is online and has the best learning experience possible. Dr. John Higginbottom, many of you will know, this is really his idea, Advanced Practice, so we're very grateful to John for thinking up this idea and getting us going, and myself, Regina. So you know that Advanced Practice is really funded by the Ministry of Health to provide leadership, education, and guidance to the mental health field, and to help develop and put effective evidence-based psychosocial rehabilitation into place. We are very grateful to our instructors for the support and their expertise. And all of our sessions are archived. So we notice that people all over the world do look at them. And so we're proud of our high quality learning opportunities. So we hope that you have a scout around there, have a good look, and hopefully you'll find some things of interest. Just a note about evaluation. We are always trying to improve. So the more information and feedback that you can give us, really the better. So we love to hear from you, and we got some great feedback from our previous session. So just wanted a shout out to you for just taking the time, because we really want to hear from you and hear what's working and hear how we can improve. So thank you for that. So the purpose really of Advanced Practice is to support clinicians and managers responsible providing recovery-oriented PSR services, transferring of knowledge, expert clinician consultation, providing training and education events to develop these website resources, and support the Provincial Advisory Committee and the community of PSR practice in general. And that's you. This particular series on employment, you'll know, is funded by the Ministry of Advanced Education. So we're very grateful to them for giving us a little bit of money for this series. And that's the second time we've received this grant funding. And so hopefully you find this work relevant to your practice and it enhances the work that you do. But we are very grateful to the Ministry of Advanced Education for supporting us in this way. So the series we've talked about, so we've heard first of all from Chris Arnold around helping people to get and keep jobs. Last session was on IPS. Wonderful 3 presenters. That session is archived. Got some great feedback. People really like that. Today, you know, is the work integration. April 1st will be a woman called Suzanne Kennedy, a lawyer here in Canada, with tremendous interest, I guess, in just helping people think about the intersection of law and employment. So I'm really looking forward to that session as well. Then we welcome Chris Arnold back, who's going to speak a little bit more about positive behavior supports in employment. And finally, we welcome you to come and chat with some of the experts for our final closing panel on May 13th. So again, we're very appreciative for your continued support, and we love to hear your feedback. So it is my great pleasure to welcome 2 wonderful women in the world of occupational therapy, of course, and employment. I begin with Dr. Terry Krupa, who's a professor in the School of Rehabilitation Therapy at Queen's University and chair of research and post-professional programs. She holds cross appointments in the Department of Psychiatry and the School of Nursing. Her scholarly interests focus on approaches to enable the full community participation and activity health of people who experience significant disability. She's a particular focus on employment-related initiatives and mental health-related disabilities. And also her good partner, Dr. Rosemary Lysat, is an associate professor in the School of Rehabilitation Therapy at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario, and the chair of the Occupational Therapy Program. Her professional expertise in the areas of work rehabilitation, assistive technologies, community mobility, and program evaluation. Her primary research focuses on our work participation and social inclusion of people in marginalized groups. So this amazing high-powered team are going to do a trip for us today. So with that, I hand you over to both. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Regina. We appreciate the introduction. I hope you haven't built us up too much, but we always enjoy working with Regina, and it's a delight to meet the rest of you here today, even if it's virtually. And so I'm Rosemary Lysett, and this is my colleague, Terry Krupa. Might have to move this over a little bit, but we're in our not very sophisticated studio here in Queen's University, which is also my office. So we're really pleased to be able to talk to you today about a topic very near and dear to our hearts, which is work integration social enterprises. And we hope... Oh,
guys, share your webcam as well, please.
Oh, sorry. Oh, good. That's a little better?
That's even better.
All right, so again, to reorient you, I'm Rosemary and this is Terry. And we're ready to go. So I think we can start, oops. Just getting the technology straight here. All right, so here is an overview of what we will be covering this morning. And we'll be starting with just a little bit of an introduction to what the concept is that we're speaking about here. And we'll then give you some of the philosophy that's supporting the idea of work integration social enterprises and why we might want to consider them as an employment option. We'll go over some of the approaches to social enterprises that we're seeing here in the mental health field, and then talk about some of the research evidence that supports this and perhaps the evidence that is still needed. Then we'll get into some of the challenges that are prevalent in the field in terms of having these grow and proliferate and being accepted more broadly. And then finally, we'll end up with some strategies that seem to be emerging relative to success of this approach. And we intend to leave some question time at the end as well. So we'll be taking a look at the chat and any questions that you put in as we go along. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I'll let you do that. Yeah. So we'll start with an overview of what a work integration social enterprise is. I know that many of you may be familiar with WISEs, but just so we get everybody on the same page, we thought we would start with a few examples of what these can look like. So you have an image in your heads of what a work integration social enterprise might look like. And the three we're going to give you today are all Canadian examples. The first one is a company called Fresh Start, which is based in Toronto. And that's a cleaning company that does cleaning of both residential and commercial types of properties. And they've expanded to doing things like lawn care and snow removal, and all kinds of specialty services like cleaning bed bugs, doing deep cleaning, removing hoarded materials from properties where people are about to be evicted, and so on. Some things that are very interesting about this particular business are that it was started by consumer survivors in the city of Toronto with some funding from the city at a time when that was there was money available for social enterprise development. And it is one that is completely run and administered and operated by people with serious mental illness. So everyone from the top administrators right down to the frontline workers are people who are survivors. And it's very democratically developed and has been a fairly long-running social enterprise, which is very successful in its sector. The second one is a smaller business that operates in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. Pet Stuff on the Go is a company that develops and sells products for caring for your pet, and they deliver them right to the door of people that may not be able to get out and pick up such products on their own. It's a business that was started by a larger group that was affiliated with the Nova Scotia Hospital called Affirmative Enterprises. And they see themselves as a training transitional type of business. They hire people with serious mental illness, and they provide training in what they see as 4 different areas. So they've got clerical positions, they have retail sales clerks, they have people doing packaging, and also people that go out and do the deliveries. And so you're seeing there kind of a broad-based business, which has got a very single focus on pet equipment and supplies, but providing primarily training for the people who work there and assuming that they will ultimately move on to employment elsewhere. A third example we wanted to share with you is a business called Collection Innova, which is a clothing manufacturer that's based in Montreal, Quebec. And what they do is they actually produce, design, and sew clothing that's accessible. So it's for people with disabilities, and it's comfortable and stylish clothing that they can readily don and doff. And that was created a number of years ago, in 1998 actually, when one of the major psychiatric facilities in the Montreal area closed down. And their board was really looking seriously at ways that they would generate meaningful community employment and activity for the people who were now going to be living in community. And so this is part of a larger group that started some social enterprises, and it's known as a social economy company. And their goal was to provide stable and rewarding jobs that are paid at competitive wages. So that gives you kind of an image of what WISEs could look like. Overall, what we would describe a WISE as is an organization that provides goods and services in the public marketplace. So they're things that are available for anybody in the community to buy, or they may sell directly to certain agencies. Like all businesses, they are like a regular business, and they're trying to make money. And so they're trying to generate wealth. In the case of a social enterprise, it's not for personal wealth, it's really to improve the wealth of everyone involved. They also are trying to meet certain social goals, which not all companies are. So their primary focus in this particular iteration of social enterprise is to create employment for some kind of group who's marginalized relative to the workforce. They're trying to generally reduce poverty, enhance social inclusion of people, and improve their quality of life. So we're aware that probably a number of you have had contact with social enterprises, and we thought we would try having you use the voting function that we see on this software, and maybe just have, I know there's more than one person sometimes represented by a name, but if people could just raise their hand if they know of a social enterprise or have had contact in one way or another with one. And Matt, I'm not sure how we will see our votes. We're looking at 35 people signed on.
There's some hands coming up.
We see some hands coming up on the side. We see 4 so far. I think that they probably all. Oh. Okay, so just 4. And I wonder if we could get some of you even just to type in the social enterprises that you know of.
There's one there, computer repair and animal care.
Okay.
Cafe.
The cafe, Garden Gate, is that a shop? Like a vegetable market, perhaps? Food market, pet bakery?
Cafe. Yeah.
Organic
Cafe.
food sales, okay.
Cornerstone Cafe. Teamworks, yeah.
Yep, Teamworks is another one, we know them.
Oh, Eastman Roasters,
Yeah, fantastic. Jen, you know a few of them.
yeah. Cleaning solutions. Yeah, we learned a lot about cleaning solutions recently.
Yeah,
Crazy Cookie, I know them too. Great.
yeah,
Good.
excellent.
All right, so people do know.
Hmm. Very good. Yeah, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what we've discovered in the Canadian market relative to social enterprise in a few minutes.
Okay, so it sounds like the audience has had some experience, some knowledge of this, and so now we're taking you back in this presentation to look at the philosophical foundations, and really, you know, what this means is we're going to look at what some of the thinking behind these are, like what are the ideas that lead to the development of this. And when we think about the ideas, we could kind of frame them in relation to one overarching question. So how is the low work participation and the social economic marginalization of people with mental illness understood? You know, what are we thinking is the root cause? WISEs have actually been considered a form of community economic development, which is a larger approach to dealing with social and economic concerns in our communities. In a CED approach, there's an assumption that if we look at our societies, you will find that particular groups of people appear to be particularly marginalized from the workforce. So it may be in high unemployment rates. It may be that we have a sense that we can define a group as being on the margins. Even if people are working, we may have a sense that systematically somehow they're being undermined, like whether they don't get access to benefits, whether they're largely part-time employed, or you know, highly vulnerable to being laid off, that kind of thing. And within WISE, there's an assumption then within CED that you can look at particular groups of people who are vulnerable to systematic forms of employment marginalization, and we have some listed here. Women, you know, certainly are a group. If you look internationally in particular, that's where a lot of WISE efforts have been in a lot of developing nations. Immigrants, racialized minorities, didn't put one here, but another really important one in the Canadian scene are Indigenous communities. And people with disabilities, and of course our focus being people with mental illness. Now, if the assumption is that they're being systematically marginalized, which is then suggesting that, you know, it's not like they're doing anything wrong necessarily, but there are forces operating on them that are keeping them out, that need to be exposed, then the philosophy would require that we answer that question, and then we'd have to ask, well, what are the forces of marginalization that are actually operating? And for us, we'd be interested in people with mental illness. Now, I want to highlight that when you look at the scholarship in this area, like the knowledge advancement in this area of CED, and sort of this idea of justice in relation to access to these kind of opportunities like fair employment, people who are specialists in the area would say, look, there are probably some common features across all these groups. So there might be some common things we think are marginalizing people across these groups, you know, that are keeping them on sort of the outs. But if you're doing work in the area, there is the suggestion that there are also very distinct things. And so you need to understand the way it is for the group that you're operating with, within, exactly the way this marginalization is working for them. Which means that even though, for instance, we work in the area of mental health, in the field of mental health, we can learn a lot from looking at those other groups. But we also need to look within ourselves to sort of sort out what's going on here. And so here's the kinds of things we see proposed as issues. So one is this notion that there are structures within the way our work is constructed in our society that are problematic. One that's brought up frequently is that our work structures are highly individualistic. And so workers are treated as individuals, not as collectives, right? So we look for, you know, a worker has to be able to perform to a certain level. A worker has to act to a certain level. And there are these things that are rating workers individually. So some kind of notion of standards to live up to that are very individualistic. The second, and it kind of goes with individualism, is that our work structures are pretty competitive. And so we might talk a lot about the fact that, oh, listen, to get a job in today's economy that's really worthwhile, you need to have an education, right? So we'd say, well, I have, undergraduate degree, let's say, and I specialized in a certain area, and it really makes me competitive. But to the extent that, for instance, now I have that degree, and that maybe somebody with mental illness has the exact same degree as me, they're still competitively disadvantaged, even though they have that advantage. So that at every level, we see kind of competition as letting people in or keeping them out. The other thing, which is probably the driving force for all of it, is this last point, and the idea that our economy has this very strong orientation to profits for individual wealth. And so like Rosemary highlighted, listen, when we do WISEs, it's not like we're not interested in making a profit. But the issue isn't that we're not making a profit to make other people rich. We're making a profit to grow the business and to increase the wealth of the people that are working there. So in our economy, there's this ongoing pressure to make more money, to make more profits, which then goes back to the competition and performance. How that trickles down, really briefly, is now you start to see it in terms of societal attitudes. So we sort of buy in that certain people can't fit in. We see certain hiring practices that get developed to maintain that. We then construct things like income support systems, which will support people who are kept out, but then also keep people out even more because they're disadvantaged. And then, of course, we have people who are living in chronic poverty, and part of the competition is, if I can dress better for an interview, I might get the job. I have an advantage, and again, you can pull it through even further. So in community economic development, we're looking at businesses being developed really with a view to neutralizing the sources of disadvantage. So you're trying to use the business structure to actually capitalize on the strengths of people and to create the conditions that would help them be able to work. While you're still focusing on delivering very high quality products and services. I will just mention that we're going to talk about this largely as it's developed in Canada, but this is an internationally applied approach to dealing with these kinds of disadvantages. Okay. Here on this slide, I'm just highlighting around neutralizing disadvantage. Two studies I'll talk about just really briefly before I turn it over to Rosemary. And this was first study was a study by Ferguson that looked at a business model that was developed for homeless youth that sort of looked at like what are the actual skills and strengths that homeless youth have or at-risk youth have that could be applied into particular businesses. And a second study by Harvey that actually looked at how business structures and WISEs are actually organized to help people be able to work. And those references are on the list, just time-wise. I'm going to go back to this one slide. This slide is actually just a summary of everything that I've said, highlighting for you that a traditional approach in mental health to unemployment has been the idea that, well, people are unemployed because they have a problem, and therefore we correct the problem and we support them. We work with employers, in a really individual way to help people fit in, and then workers are employees. WISE, again, moves away from that traditional approach to say, listen, maybe unemployment reflects something like unemployment is actually marginalization, right? Systemic kind of marginalization. In this way, we engage a community of people to create a business interest and develop business structures that are supportive. We play right in the field to try to secure a market share of the business. And now workers just aren't employees. They're also entrepreneurs and have more control over their lives.
All right, so let's think about social businesses as one form of this social economy and social enterprise. And what you're going to see is that they actually fit within a much larger conceptualization of how our economy functions. So I'm not going to describe all of these economies in a lot of detail, but basically I think everyone's familiar with the public sector, and you know what the private sector is. And then there's this big social economy, which includes all kinds of socially oriented organizations. So that's including all your not-for-profit organizations, everybody from the World Wildlife Fund to PSR Canada, all sit down there in the social economy. So, your for example, charging to attend conferences, and you're raising money to support a cause and so on. So there's actually economy going on within those sectors. If you look right in the, oh, and one thing, the reason that this comes from a book by Jack Corder, Mook and Armstrong out of U of T, and they've done this really nice analysis of how the economy is laid out. And one of the things that they highlight is that actually all the economies are interdependent. So, you know, if you're a private sector business, you're you're selling goods to government offices, they're buying from you, you're following their guidelines and so on. There's a lot of overlap. And the same thing with the social economy. And if you look at the overlap portion between the private sector and the social economy, we're all doing business in the same market space. And so that's why there's some overlap there. So social businesses may be competing directly with private sector businesses in the same kind of area of commerce. But right in the center is really where you see this community economic development. That's really where we see this perfect intersection between the social enterprises and other community economic development organizations like co-ops and credit unions and so on, and the private sector and the public sector. They're buying from one another, selling to one another, and they're all kind of operating in that same space. That worked. Actually, that worked. So one of the things that gets a little bit confusing about this is that we have several names for these things, and you'll actually even see the different names on the marquees of the businesses that some of you have mentioned. So they're known as social businesses, social purpose businesses, social firms, social ventures. They're all referring to the same thing, but all of those terms generally refer to a work integration type of social enterprise versus another type of social enterprise, which may just be about fostering clean energy or selling organic vegetables or something. And incidentally, social firms is the name you would see these things incorporated under in some place like the United Kingdom or in Europe, in Australia. Affirmative businesses, alternative businesses, social cooperatives, consumer-run businesses, rehab businesses, these are all terms that are also used to refer to them, but they'd be at another level describing the type of business structure that they're incorporated under. And again, you'll see these variously used and interchangeably used. So, I'm going to tell you briefly about an environmental scan we did of social businesses in Canada, and that was a study you see by Terry and myself and Joyce Brown and Catherine Vallée, who are in Toronto and Montreal respectively. And this was a cross-Canada study which we did looking at the spread of social enterprise in the mental health sector. And you can actually see the results of this study in the Mental Health Commission of Canada's report on the affirmative workforce, which is readily available on the internet to anyone who searches on the affirmative aspiring workforce. So what we were doing was trying to identify all the social enterprises we could in Canada that are operating in the mental health sector. And our criteria were that they had to be a registered business that was operating for trade in the general marketplace. They had to have a set of bylaws. They had to be striving for financial sustainability. So it really was not just that they were bringing in some extra money for another larger agency, but they were trying to be economically self-sufficient, and that they had a mission that included people with mental illness. So here's a bit about what we found. And again, this is just going to be a really high level overview, and you can see the details in the report. We found about 100 social businesses in Canada that were specifically creating employment opportunities for people with mental illness. Most of them were actually in the small business sector. And if you know anything about the way businesses are delineated in Canada, that would be any kind of business that has fewer than 100 positions. And in the service sector, it's fewer than 50 positions. So they're mostly small businesses, as you would probably anticipate. Most of them are in Ontario, BC, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada. In Atlantic Canada, there's a couple of hubs around the Halifax-Dartmouth area, and there's a few in Newfoundland as well. We found from the number of positions they reported that there were probably about 1,500 employment positions that were being created by these enterprises. And they were selling a whole range of goods and services. So some of the ones that were entered here on the chat screen are really indicative of that. And so the most frequently reported ones that came out in the study were things that are in the food service industry. Landscaping is very popular, cleaning and maintenance, recycling, and then contractor assembly work were the top ones that are in our chart. Just one thing to keep in mind is that if you look at businesses in Canada, quite apart from the specific work activity they're doing, there's a lot of different models and structures that people work under. And they tend to have a certain credibility no matter what they are. And so, you've got people that have got family-owned farms, and you've got people that open up their own business doing a particular service for other people. You've got cooperatives, you've got the large for-profits, you've got not-for-profits. And a person could work in any of these, and they could even work as a private contractor for one of these others. And so we see quite a lot of diversification in the Canadian economy. And so we wanted to better understand how some of these WISEs were being incorporated and operated. And I guess want to make the additional point that, sometimes people will look at this sector and say, well, that's not real work. And yet we wouldn't say that if we saw, a person that opens a motorcycle repair shop on their own and they're working hard every day and doing commerce, we would consider them to be a worker. And so we want to take a fairly broad view of what is work and what is legitimate work. So when we took all of the information we gathered, we found that there were probably three major legal structures that the social enterprises are using in the mental health sector. So one is an agency-run business. So this is when they exist within a parent organization. They're keeping separate financial sheets, and so they're financially responsible for their own work. However, the bigger decisions tend to be made at the agency level. So there are a number of advantages and disadvantages to this, as you'll see in all of them. One is that it actually helps the agency meet their mission, if that is to improve the social integration and the well-being of people with a serious mental illness. And the other is that they quite often will contribute certain resources towards the running of the businesses, which may be in terms of expertise or maybe actual positions that help the business to run. The negative side of that is there actually can be some financial risk to the larger parent agency if the business doesn't do well, for example. And there can be loss of autonomy for the business. So it may not be perceived as a real separate business when it's under the umbrella of, for example, a mental health organization. So another large category is the not-for-profit cooperative. So when a group of people with a mental illness form a co-op to which everyone pays to belong, and they join it because they're trying to create their own employment and to foster a sense of community. So this is nice in the sense that the workers have control over their business decisions. The members of the co-op would vote on any purchases and directions that the business goes. And they may be able to take money out of what the co-op generates in order to build new opportunities and expand. The downside here can be that sometimes they're doing a kind of profit share model, and it may mean that you can do really well with that if the business does really well, but if not, everybody's sharing and they may have a lower, as it would work out, hourly wage based on what the cooperative earns. And then the final one is a not-for-profit corporation. So when they actually register as a nonprofit And they establish themselves under the legal structures with a board of directors, and they can create their own partnerships with other agencies, but it's completely business oriented. So one of the advantages of going this way is that they actually, through having a board and so on, and the board would be comprised like any board where you bring in the expertise you need. And so they would have expertise available if they have legal experts, financial people, marketing specialists, and so on that they can draw on to build the business. And then the downside is you're kind of on your own, and the business does well, and it can succeed or it can fail. So just this is just briefly what we got when we were actually asking them in terms of the raw data, how are you incorporated? And so you'll see it's a bit of a dog's breakfast because several of them were claiming they were a nonprofit. The nonprofit, you see, definitely is the highest. But then some of them were saying they were a nonprofit and a charity, and some were a charity, and some were a nonprofit and a cooperative. And so they'll sometimes have more than one legal designation. Sort of the point of that one. And then the final point on this, I think, is that we wanted to point out that within those structures, there also are different purposes for which these businesses exist. And so some are considering themselves to be transitional businesses, and so they're essentially trying to help the people who work there build a resume, build some skills, and transition out into the larger marketplace. Others are employment for the sake of employment. So your Fresh Start and the Innova are both places where someone can go get a job and stay there, work with the business, grow the business. And then we found a number that were mixed in that they were somewhat transitional in nature, but they would have people who would develop expertise in the business and move up within the business and actually take on a leadership role and end up remaining with the business for many years.
This question here, there's a question around this. Liz is asking, can you please give examples of known businesses that fit into each? I think they're meaning the incorporation model.
Incorporation model.
Yeah, because Rosemary and I have done a lot of work around this, around the whole sector of disability, and so ones that just come to mind, not-for-profit corporation, for instance, here in Kingston, we started a not-for-profit corporation started that was an umbrella organization with several businesses under it called Voices, Opportunities, and Choices Employment Club. An agency-run business, I'm trying to think of in the intellectual disability field, the Linen Place.
Well, I was going to, there's several where it's, I can't think of,
is Coast agency run?
Coast Mental Health actually runs the Landscaping with Heart business. It's actually within the structure of Coast. That's a great example.
And Teamworks, all of the Works businesses in Thunder Bay would be examples of cooperatives.
They're co-ops.
And they're actually registered as cooperatives.
And there's another cooperative in Penticton. I'm not sure if it's still operating, but they're again a cooperative.
Hope that's helpful.
Yeah. And so when you look at all of these different models, you wonder, like, how do they exist and where do they come from and why are they so different? Part of it is where they came from, and so it's kind of the need that existed at the time and what opportunities there were, and maybe there was a certain funding structure available, so they took that opportunity and built it, and it led them to a certain incorporation structure or a certain type of business. Part of it is government and policy, and certainly in Canada we have 10 or 12 different structures across the country in terms of how you incorporate a business and different laws around this. But in Quebec, they have their own system of regulating these businesses, and actually quite a big social enterprise sector. And so that's why you see businesses there. And I meant to mention about Innova that I did say it was a mixed workforce, that probably about 30 to 40% of their employees are people with a serious mental illness, and the other people have other forms of disadvantage. And that's specifically related to policy in the province of Quebec and the way they're established. Then I mentioned actually about the different types of grants that may be available, and some are available for a certain time period, and so they'll be representative of that time period, like like Fresh Start in Toronto, where there were many initiatives at a particular time historically. And then just in terms of the consumer movement, that's really where you saw some of the consumer-driven businesses where consumers have really said, this is something that we want to take control of our work life. And they really took that, built on the strength of the consumer movement to move forward with a cooperative or some form of incorporation that actually empowered all of the people within the business.
So with that background, I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes to give you a little bit of a background to the state of the evidence related to this. And certainly one of the issues for us in the mental health sector is always, we keep hearing, evidence-based practice, evidence-based practice. And so we always have to sort of sort out the evidence base for what we're doing. Did give you in the reference list that you'll see at the end a few articles that do give some overview of literature scholarship in the area. And we are seeing a growing evidence base in this field. And so if I had to take that, let's say the 40 articles or so I might find in relation to this now that have been published in peer-reviewed journals, you might be able to divide them into 4 kind of areas. One are articles that are talking about the position of WISEs relative to the broader community economy. And so that whole philosophy background that I gave you earlier, that's where you would see that written. The interesting thing for us in the mental health field, that's not typically where it's written. So Rosemary and I learned that not by going to the disability field or the mental health field, we learned that by going to business fields, because business areas talk very much about this. The second is the area of processes and outcomes of business development. Quite a proliferation of articles related to this. Articles that will talk about, again, like these legal structures or decisions that were made or ways that businesses were organized to structure the development of businesses. A third one, and less so in terms of number, are the actual evaluation of outcomes. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I'll tell you about some of them in a minute. So you will see some that look at business outcomes, like are the business sustainable, how many people are actually employed, how much money do they make, how much money do the people themselves make, that kind of thing. And then the other are health and well-being outcomes. And you will see in the reference list that's at the end of this an article by Michael Roy and a group that we're working with in Scotland that has really been trying to take this forward to say, well, how can we forward or advance this idea that if employment actually helps with people's health and well-being, which we say is part of recovery, then social businesses or work integration social enterprises should be doing this. And so that group in Scotland started a review on health and well-being outcomes associated with social enterprises generally, but you will see that a lot of the work actually comes down to WISEs. And then the last area we see is in worker experiences and tensions. Researchers from Australia have done a lot of work related to this in terms of looking at what the quality is like for people who are working in the business. Marc Corbière from Quebec has done some work around, well, when workers get into this business, what are they looking at doing, that kind of thing. So that's kind of broadly where the articles are. And I see there's that thing around the references, but okay, thanks very much. They're there. So, to be honest, there is a challenge to this, and Rosemary and I have been working on this now for years and years. And sometimes you want to say there's so many challenges to trying to exploit this, and learn more about it. Maybe we should just walk away from it. But we find it so intriguing and we love it so much that we keep doing it. But a couple of things. Number one is you have to remember that in the mental health field, when we talk about an evidence base, they keep coming in evidence base, often what they're talking about is what's the evidence base for a service? So tell me what the program is, tell me what the intervention is. But WISEs aren't programs, right? They're not services, they offer services, they're businesses. And so immediately the language that we need to speak about is I'm not entering a program territory, I'm actually entering the world of work territory and the community within which the world of work exists. The second is, if you know research, we kind of try to say, well, if I'm going to study it, I have to put it into a box somehow to say what it is and exactly. So you're doing this. These are the processes of change. But actually, we already gave you the hint that there's a lot of variation in these things. And so there should be. Like, no one would tell the Canadian economy, oh, you should only have one type of business and it can only operate in one way, right? Because it doesn't make any sense. Businesses have to be organic and, sometimes they even fail, right? In fact, people could argue that services fail too, but, there you go. The other is, and this is something Roy talks about a fair bit, if we are going to make the argument in the mental health field that something like engaging in the social business could lead to health and well-being, we have to say how that happens. And the truth is, it's not like taking a pill. It's not like, I take the pill and I feel better tomorrow. I have other problems, but, this happens. It's actually quite a complex intervention. And so probably the processes that are in operation that lead to health and well-being are very, very complicated, and they're going to take very complex models for us to put forward to be able to show that if you do this, you could get this in the positive side. The last, and probably the biggest thing we fight against in trying to move this forward, is there's a real dominant view that kind of holds on to the traditional employments to employment support. And so we actually could present in business conferences all over the world, and people would have no trouble with this at all. They'd engage in conversations. We go to mental health field, and if I want to put into a journal, for instance, if a reviewer who has no knowledge of this, they'll come back and say, well, what's the program? What's the intervention? How is this not this? So there are a lot of uphill battles to get the field to kind of shift into this.
Okay, so we've certainly identified a number of challenges, and you can imagine it's a challenging field. And it's perhaps like business in general. Without a few risks, there's really no gains. And so we want to just go through some of the things that tend to be challenges to growth, as sustainability, and also acceptance within the broader mental health field. And we've identified through some of the studies we've done some sort of areas of tension, as we refer to them, related to the growth and acceptance of this sector. And so we're going to go through the 6 that you see here on this slide, one by one, and bring up a few points, and hope that this gets you thinking a little bit about some of the areas of tension, but also areas of opportunity. So I'll talk first about the first thing, which is compensation structures and strategies. So how do people get paid? And as I mentioned in the beginning, there are certainly different ways that people are paid based on their incorporation structure primarily. So of course you have minimum wage, you have profit shares that are primarily in your cooperatives. People who are primarily in training organizations quite often get what they will call a training stipend. And then you can contract with workers as well and pay them a certain amount for doing certain jobs. So for example, if they were going to come and do so many lawns for you, you would pay them for those lawns. So some of the issues that come out here is, first of all, there is a whole range of compensation models going on. And sometimes you find them within one agency. People are being paid all different rates and in different ways. And so, that can make it a little bit challenging. And when the government and others try to pin this thing down and how it's operating, or people try to criticize them, they'll find all kinds of different structures for payment. Some of them, which are not the best, or people are not earning as much as they might through other forms of employment. Another issue that comes up with the compensation structure is that actually, because of the disability employment support systems that we have operating in all the different provinces, and the different rules around what you can earn in addition to your disability support payments, it tends to be, we're finding this everywhere, even in environments where there isn't too much clawback on wage, that people are concerned about losing their disability support, and consequently they'll work a maximum of so many hours a month. And so I think in BC it's around 40 hours a month that people are or maybe it's more than that they're willing to work, and then they won't. So what you end up getting because of this is, people are willing to take not the highest wages because they're actually seeing it as a supplemental wage. And in addition, what you get is a very part-time workforce. And as much as it seems like businesses save money by having part-time workers because they're not paying out the same sort of benefits, it actually is very costly to have a whole lot of part-timers to keep up with and to schedule and train and so on. Another issue is just around, how does a company remain profitable when you're paying under the optimal wage circumstances? And if you get into the living wage debate, we're actually paying people at higher than minimum wage. And every time the minimum wage goes up to kind of move towards that living wage, or municipalities, for example, take on the living wage, you got to start paying more, and then it becomes harder to meet your bottom line and to be profitable. So you're kind of weighing the advantages of paying people more and the disadvantages of maybe the business won't keep going and then everybody's out of a job. If in the training organizations, you've got to really stop and say, how long are we letting people carry on as trainees? And we'll get to best practices in that realm, but it is a query, that people can't stay on at a training wage for a long time. Because it may, from an ethical standpoint, not be correct or not advantageous to them at all. And then just some of the issues around profit shares. As I mentioned before, you can do really well with a profit share, but you can do really poorly with a profit share. And then you could say you've got a workforce that's earning less than minimum wage. So the next one is around the next slide.
Oh, sorry. Say something else there.
Oh, no. So the next issue is around inclusion, and this is a really interesting one because I think there's a widespread perception that social businesses are segregating workers. And yet we've seen so many creative approaches to including people that we really wanted to expand on this notion of how do you actually advance inclusion through social enterprise, because there absolutely are ways. So we've identified 3 groupings of strategies for ways that businesses have found to include people. So one is within the work site itself. So the one point that just has to be made is that the notion of inclusion actually includes this whole idea of belonging and feeling like part of something. And it could be that within a social business where you're being explicit about your needs, you're not hiding your disability in any way, and people understand you, that there may be a sense of belonging that comes with that is not necessarily replicated in some other work settings. But a second way that people can be included and part of a broader community profile within a business is through having an integrated workforce, such as you saw at Innova. And a number of businesses are working with this idea of having people that have a disability without and others without a disability and having them work together. So in Innova, if you've got 30 to 40% of the people who have a mental illness, you might actually, and then other people are, immigrants and people from other women who are new to the workforce and so on, then you actually might be sort of replicating the outer society within your business. And another way that seems to percolate up is that when people are doing work where they feel like it's important work and the society is actually valuing the fact that they do it, for example, if you're going out and wiping out bed bugs and nobody else wants to do that work, but it's an incredibly valuable service to the community, then people can be very proud of their contributions. And it might be just through the product that they sell that they find that everybody wants. And there's a certain sense of inclusion that goes with meaningful contribution. A second category is, of course, direct public contact. And so we find that through many of the types of businesses we see, people are actually working with the public, or they're out mowing their lawns, or they're selling them something within a shop or what have you. So that can be direct, or it can be, through internet sales. It can be over the phone. we found that there's a couple of different markets that are really prevalent in this area. Sometimes people are selling primarily within the mental health sector, and so it might be that you're providing landscaping services, and it's mostly for public housing, or it's mostly for businesses or for apartment blocks that are run by, say, like Coast Mental Health or an equivalent agency. And there's really nothing wrong with that, and it's actually sometimes a good business move to be able to supply your own with the services that you're providing. But it's just a different dynamic. Other services are being provided in the broader community, and or people are going out through the community to actually deliver the service. And a lot of agencies do things in terms of being kind of a good corporate citizen, where they're actually doing public outreach, participating in social events in the community and community activities, contributing product and what have you. And so that actually increases public contact. Now, and then the final category is really about the relationship between the community and the business. And sometimes that can be as simple as you're buying local, you're buying from another company, they're buying from you. And so we as the employees are actually part of that whole thing. And maybe the work you're doing is recognized by your community because it is socially valued, and so you're getting awards and that sort of thing that may be very much valued and then make the workers have a certain pride. We'll go to the next one. Another point is around career progression, and again, a point of criticism is that people will become stagnated within a social business and not move forward. So, you know, that may be true in some agency-run businesses, although we have seen instances where people have moved up into leadership position within those. It may depend on the product and service or service line. So if you see a business like the pet stuff and they're clearly identifying, okay, we've got clerical positions, we've got manual positions, we've got, you know, community driving and delivery kinds of positions, the more diversified the business, the more people can migrate towards forms of work that appeal to their skills and their interests. So you know, it's just one way of looking at it in terms of being able to build skills and move through a career. You also get some discussion around, you know, within a social business, if you have some people that are really strong performers and are really selling well or creating or producing a lot of product or something, do you want to let them go? Because actually your business does really well because you've got these high producers. And the counter argument will be really, you know, if they're producing at that level, why aren't they working in a community business? Well, you know, there's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe the person chooses to work within the social enterprise because there are many gains for them through that. So it's really just a kind of a debate as to how that's dealt with. And if workers are given opportunity to make a choice, do I want to work here? Do I want to work somewhere else? And it really has to be about individual choice. And then there's a number of businesses that, especially cooperatives, where they actually exist to help people move into their own businesses at a certain point. And that can be very career affirming and helping people to make career choices and be entrepreneurial and live out a dream, should they have one that relates to their own work and economic welfare.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about just last sort of three challenges that you saw in that initial list. And that one that we have here is the perception of the legitimacy or credibility as a business. So one of the arguments that gets leveled against these businesses, and I think we've sort of given you a background to where this might come from, is that, well, you know, they're not real work or they're not real businesses. And actually, you know, I find it a lot in the mental health sector. You know, some people have some sort of a set way of viewing, well, this is the community workforce and that's the only thing it is. And I think, you know, when Rosemary was showing you the slide of the public sector, you know, like all the different sectors and the range of work options, well, actually, there are a lot of legitimate forms of business. So, you know, how do we convince people that you can set up a business structure, which is a business, it's legitimized legally, and it operates using, like, within legal standards for equity and fair employment, And certainly part of this is then understanding, well, why are people not seeing it this way? And from our research, we see a couple of things. Number one is the field is compromised in seeing it as a legitimate business from its history. So I have had people say to me, something like, Terry, tell me again how a bunch of people with mental illness working together in one spot is in a sheltered workshop. And I could answer back, and say, well, first of all, because they're earning minimum wage or higher. Second, they're actually greeting the public. Third, they're making business decisions. I mean, none of those things existed in sheltered workshops. That's not how they were structured. But it's not the perception of the field. And so we are working against this notion of the idea of people working together as in some way constitutes a sheltered setting or a lesser than a real business setting. Even though, again, like we were saying, I go to the business community, they don't have any problem with this at all. Like, what's wrong with a family deciding that they would operate a business? It's still a business, right? The second thing within this, and probably the bigger issue, is the relationship of these businesses to the mental health system. And what we're seeing is this is an area we really have to be careful about and do some more thinking about. There's nothing to say, for instance, that somebody with a serious mental illness who's working in a social business could not benefit from some form of employment support, the same way someone who's working in individual employment support models might take an employment support out. In some social business models, that employment support is actually built into the model. So we have seen some businesses where there's a partnership maybe with a local mental health center. They provide employment support directly with the businesses. But now what you see is there's a confusion in terms of, well, is this now a business or is it a program? The other thing that you can see is because of the strong program and treatment influence in the system, you'll get a drift in the business where workers who actually were really committed to seeing the business go forward will fall back to talk about people in kind of pathologizing ways. Maybe, in the context of public relations or in doing negotiations with other, groups, they will tend to step in a protective way. Where, as we pointed out, something like Fresh Start, where there's not a professional to be had anywhere, the only people who are doing all of this are people who have lived with mental illness. And so this becomes an issue. The other thing that's a real issue, too, is there is a lack of strategic visioning around this in the field. So to the extent that businesses should be able to develop in an organic way to be sustainable and meet workers' needs, doesn't mean that we can't create some standards so that all of us could say, listen, if you're going to call yourself a WISE, however you go about doing that, here's some things that really need to be in place for us to be sure that it's a WISE and it's credible business. And the other issue that's facing us is how we are going to brand these in the broader community. So you'll see the dialogue around, do we tell people that it's a social enterprise, that people with mental illness work here? Do we not tell people and then just let the product stand for itself? Do we let the product stand for itself and then surprise people later on? So how are we actually going to do this? Next complicated one is certainly profitability and subsidy. We've said from the beginning that if these are real businesses, they have to be financially sustainable. And like all businesses, there are complex choices to be made around how to run a business to be sustainable. So for every business, when minimum wage goes up, right, in the sector, like in the employment sector, small businesses are always scurrying around the bottom line. How are they going to keep people working, pay them this wage, and have things keep running in a profitable way? In the social business, there's that extra thing because you have to add the social goals in. And so there are always complex choices to be made about how we structure businesses to support in a way that's still balanced, right, and to meet social inclusion needs. The second issue in this is what actually would constitute subsidies. So in our research, for instance, we found that we do see social businesses that can be sustainable in the sense that they are able to produce the revenues they need to offset the costs of direct production of goods and services. So good businesses are able to pay all their workers from what they make, and they're also able to buy, all the resources they need to do it. And they may even be able to put some away for the future, like so in that case, that piece of equipment breaks down. What they're having trouble doing is actually paying for the higher level administrative positions. So let's say the person now that's going to go out looking for other business, opportunities, or the HR person that's going to be developing different, production kind of rules, let's say. Because those people aren't actually producing. And you will see businesses that are actually receiving some subsidy that gets directed to that. So of course, one of the things we have to ask is, well, what constitutes a subsidy? What subsidies would be acceptable? Remembering that all business gets forms of subsidy, like all forms of business. So, I would always argue people back, well, someone said to me, well, if they get subsidy, then they're not a real business. Well, Air Canada is a business, and they got lots of subsidy as far as I can see. But businesses get different, benefits in terms of tax reductions, etc. But as a field, we need to decide this.
Yeah.
The last point is really the sensitivity to potential for exploitation. Because this is a group of people for whom historically there has not been the focus on paying them fair wages, it's very easy for a business to fall into sort of saying, well, maybe they don't need to get as much, or for outside people looking to have work done, to suggest that that's a possibility.
Yeah, and I think that speaks a little bit to what Liz has brought up, the point about, if you have a business and it's an agency-run business, and agency staff are helping to meet productivity quotas when some of the workers are not able to do so. How do you kind of deal with that dual role that staff may have, sort of jumping in and being the saviors and sort of trying to balance that bottom line, the social bottom line versus the economic bottom line. And, you really raise a great point. And we'll maybe be able to address this a little bit more at length during the discussion period. But we have seen, we've seen this even in different sectors where there's more tendency towards that. Like a lot of businesses in this sector, we haven't seen as much of that because the workers are pretty much autonomously in charge of the work they're doing. If it is an agency-run business, that can happen. And it really is a struggle, and something that I think the agencies need to reflect on and sort of to determine, we've even seen it, in a particular situation where an agency was hiring on more and more staff who didn't have a mental illness in order to get the work done and bring in the profits. And yet then that business had to step back and reflect and say, maybe we're taking the wrong jobs on here.
Yeah.
So.
Last point, and I'll just speak to really briefly, is the extent to which social businesses are constructed to ensure worker voice and involvement. And we heard the example of businesses that can be completely run by people with mental illness themselves. But we have seen lots of employment business structures which are actually designed to ensure that workers have a voice and a real voice at the table and have control and actually have the opportunity to develop these entrepreneurism skills that we were talking about.
So we wanted to wind up with just a few best practices and how they may operate and what we've seen. These come primarily from our own research, but also some of it is the work of Social Firms UK, who have developed a model of sort of self-evaluation and helping businesses as they're growing. So what we're calling this is emerging best practices because they're really just kind of evolving. And as Terry said earlier, we really are just at the stage of doing the research to test these and see if they're broadly applicable. So one of the biggest things that we've determined is that really a social enterprise that's work generating has to start operating like a business. And all the things that Terry's already mentioned in terms of not thinking in programmatic terms, not thinking of, behavior that's not suitable for the customer service model of the business, not thinking about it as a pathology, but thinking about it as an HR issue and something that just needs to be corrected is a whole type of different approach. And as you start thinking more in terms of customer satisfaction and what are the kinds of things that we as a team need to do to satisfy our customers, you start shifting the mindset. And certainly satisfied customers are going to lead you to satisfied workers because they're going to be proud of their work and proud of what they stand for. And by the way, they have a job. So, the whole aspect of moving to more of a business orientation is critical. And as Terry mentioned already, if we see that people may need support if they go into supported employment, they need support of the same types when they're working in a social business. It might just be that the business itself inherently provides more support. And so it might look a little bit different, but it might look the same. And we've seen places where you got a job coach if you were in the social business, you got a job coach if you were out in a community. We see it as critical that businesses start thinking intentionally about what strategies they're going to use in their development to ensure that there's inclusion of the people who work there, that they're not segregated away from the public or from other people, that they have an opportunity to interact and feel like part of their community and be proud of the work they're doing. We talked about different compensation models. It's certainly an evolving science, but we're gradually, I think, more and more businesses are starting to do some research on that, the best way to compensate people in a way that's fair, across the workforce, and is also fair in terms of living wage. And businesses have to be quite intentional looking at how they're going to mitigate their financial risk, stay sustainable, but much as like what Liz has brought up, is how do we figure out what the specific points of subsidy are and actually make them more clear and explicit. So in terms of moving towards a business orientation, we've noticed a number of factors that seem to be helpful in this regard. One is by having specific business objectives and bylaws by which the organization or the business will live. That there's a separate governing body, so even if it's an agency-run business, that there is a separate governing group and board of directors. And again, a board of directors that integrates many forms of expertise and connections. Connections are always a wonderful thing when you're a business. So that there's separate financial accounting, and actually if they didn't have a financial accounting system that was separate from the agency, we didn't even include them in our study. We see that as pivotal, that really identifies you as a business that's doing business. But the more autonomous that can be, the better. That you create partnership agreements that are well laid out with specific partners. So it's not just that we're passing resources back and forth, that it's clear if there's a position that we're subsidizing that position. If we're buying from or providing a service, say, to another arm of our organization because we have a service that they need, that it's clear that we're making an actual business exchange. And that, again, that they think quite carefully about how people with mental illness who work for the business are having voice and being included in the business decisions. Then in terms of financial sustainability, a few things that might be helpful, that they actually figure out quite carefully, have a very strong business plan where they're balancing business costs with revenues. And so if you take on a new business line, you've tested it and you know that it's likely to be successful. That you bring a number of businesses under an umbrella. It really depends on the evolution of the business, whether that's feasible or whether it makes any sense at all. But in situations where we have seen the several associated businesses, one can be doing poorly for a while, or maybe seasonal, and then another one will carry it. And so that, a business doesn't go under if it goes through a bit of a rough time. And as you know, the environment for businesses to operate changes a lot over time, and they'll have their ups and downs. But the more you can diversify and share profits and losses, the better. And that's how big corporations do it all the time. They have a series of product lines, and they sort of spread out the profit and loss. And then we think about how you deal with positions that are not directly revenue generating. And so if you have a business and you've got someone who's in charge of HR or who's the main administrator, they're not out there doing the work and selling the product or making the product. And so you can see them as not actually generating revenue, but you've got to have them. Now, in the case of, say, a marketing specialist, you can say, well, if I pay a marketer $40,000 in a year and they bring in $60,000 worth of business, they paid for themselves. Not so much sometimes with other administrators. And so that's something you have to really pay attention to. And if you can find a partnership that will help cover a position, that really seems to help a lot. And then just considering a range of markets and figuring out how to procure business in various sectors, in and outside of the mental health sector.
I see there's a question, but we'll just summarize and then we can move on to questions and open up for discussion. Just to, we talked about a lot of things, but we tried to share a definition of wise to hope, that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're talking about. We tried to give you a bit of a background in terms of where these ideas come from and how they're different from kind of traditional employment support approaches. We mentioned that there's a variety of business structures and models in this field, but in the business field generally. Just remember that that's typical out there. We see there's a growing body of evidence with several challenges, and the more we get on side with this, if this is something we want to do, maybe we can break through with this. And also try to tap into some reconciling some challenges to growth, sustainability, and acceptance, while also then tying that to some solutions that we've learned. We would like to open it up to the floor. I do see that there is a question from Victor who asks a question related to his interest in starting a social enterprise for young people with developmental disabilities primarily. It's quite a long question, and I'm going to respond just because you're asking a lot of different aspects here. One of the things I would encourage you to do, Victor, is there are a lot of, or several businesses in Canada that have been developed for people with intellectual disabilities. And so it is wise to kind of say, what's being done? How are other people doing it? So one of the most innovative, energetic, vibrant business structures we've seen is actually in a rural community in Eastern Ontario. It's called Group Convex, and it's run, the businesses are run for people with developmental disabilities. They have a nice website, and Carolyn Arcan is the executive director. It may be reaching out to somebody who's done this kind of work would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. And that's one example of where they diversified and they run about 5 or 6 different businesses. Yeah. And some of them are not as productive as others, but they keep a lot of people employed in a very small community where there's not high employment otherwise. But some of the strategies they've used is to procure some solid contracts that were available that they bid on, and so they knew that they had a consistent source of revenue, and that was been very helpful to their growth. In fact, I don't know that we can share the report from the intellectual disabilities bill, can we? We just kind of conferring, because we just did a study for the intellectual disabilities field on this, and so we have several case studies. One of them was Group Convex, and that's why we're encouraging you to go there. Anybody else have any comments or questions they'd like to make in this odd format where we're reading what you're reading your questions? Yeah.
So it's Regina. I'm sure you'll have many questions, but I'll just begin by maybe just making some summary, saying that I think some key ideas in this discussion that I picked up, but I really like this idea of considering resources to neutralize sources of disadvantage. That's something that really struck me. And in that little blather, we've heard from Liz Kyo, and she has a long question as well here, but let's just try to capture some of that.
There's a comment, actually.
It's hard to scroll up. Yeah. In terms of previous comment, I like the idea of making the agency-run supported employment service separate from the agency-run business, even if supported employment staff came up with the idea. That way, the business who hires individuals requiring support on the job can be treated like any other community business in terms of their role and level of support. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Can I just can I speak to something about
mental health practitioners? I'm sorry.
Sorry, Regina. Can I just make a comment into Liz's as well, just to one of the things that we've been talking about is that one of the problems in the mental health field is we're developing these different employment approaches for people who are marginalized. It's a large number, and it's a big problem. And we seem to be developing these approaches in silos. Again, it's like we're not talking to each other. And certainly one of the things we've talked about is, could you imagine a world where the individual employment and support models and the businesses were closely connected, so that you know, easily if people are working in a social business or a work integration social enterprise and they want to move someplace else, they have access to supported employment to help them out. Or if somebody's working in a business in the community and they're going through a rough spell and they lose the job, that they can move into a business like this. Just some more coordination and cooperation between the models could really be exciting.
But I think, you know, your point's well taken in the sense that it would certainly add a certain level of legitimacy, and that's what it does if you've got a separate agency. That there is more risk, but there's certainly more legitimacy perceived by the public and maybe by the workers. I don't know. Now, April is asking if social enterprises tend to have mental health practitioners on staff for support, or is it through outreach to those groups? I think what you're asking whether they employ people with mental health backgrounds or whether they're getting a supported employment agency to come in and provide the supports, perhaps. One of the things that we've observed is that it actually can be beneficial if a business doesn't have mental health support workers. If there are people that are going to be team leaders or shop stewards or whatever you want to call them that are the specialists in the type of enterprise, it's sometimes better just to get people that are specialists from that business.
Yeah.
You know, so if you're going to have a bakery, get a baker. And we've seen how you can really sometimes find people that have that beautiful combination of skill in the thing that they do, but also a real sensitivity to people's needs. And but they, in a very big way, can make it like they can provide natural supports and actually make the person feel like, hey, I'm working with a baker here, and I'm like one of the baking crew. But some places will do that and then perhaps have a support worker who comes, you know, if there's supports available through the placement agency, if someone comes to work in the social business, and they'll bring in an outside person to provide supports. Other businesses, they do have people that are trained in the sector that work there. We're not as big a fan of that.
It does complicate. You know, just to highlight too that something like the consumer run business we presented, Fresh Start, it's not like any of their discussion says that people shouldn't be getting support from workers, you know, back in the mental health system. They just separate the two. So they don't come into the workplace, but, you know, if you need to have an appointment with whoever to talk about whatever, that's great. Get the support you need. It just doesn't come into what's happening in the workforce.
It sounds like people are appreciative of those comments and that practical feedback. Really appreciate that. Not sure if any others have some final questions. We're at about 11:53, so we probably could take maybe one, maybe two more questions. I do like the idea of just the notion of having this strategic vision and bringing together mental health services and business services. That seems to be a really good intersection that possibly your work around theory and scholarship will, I'm sure, add to that, to advancing that work. Just seeing if there are any final questions, but I think people may be a little hungry and interested in going for lunch in this part of BC. I know you're all
going to go home.
Well, perhaps it's time to go home. So on that note, please let me say thank you to you both. It's so great to have two wonderful experts in the room. Thank you so much for your time and your energy to share your knowledge and expertise. We're very grateful. Thank you very much. So
yeah, thanks for the invitation. We really enjoyed it.
Yes, it was a lot of fun.
Well, have a good night and a good weekend. Thank you kindly.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.